Good afternoon. I was asked 3 years ago, after the last symposium I was able to attend, or any of us else did, I was asked if I would do a presentation on the culture of the people, Indian people who are in this region. I'm on the program as being Virginia. Well, it's the old-fashioned Virginia that includes my state and your state. But I'm focusing on northeastern North Carolina. However, I do have to squeak in a few things from Virginia. So I'll tell you when they are so you can beware. Rather than doing a straightforward ethnography, which would put you and me both to sleep, there's a fair amount of the ethnography, it will come out in this. That's a promise. But listening to all of the stuff that's gone on yesterday and so far today, I want to hit two emphases in the way I present this. One is that one of the major new contributions that my book has made, to me it is the major one, is the new paintings by the artist Ren Harvey, who specializes in paintings of North American Indians. She grew up in Ontario, Canada, near the Grand River Reservation. So Indian faces are something she can do. And I've always felt critical of both White and Debris in the way they portrayed Indian faces. When I tried to draw one initially for this book, it came out looking like Yul Brynner. And I said, forget that. But Karen Harvey got in touch with me because Kim Sloan put her in touch with me. She was redoing the portraits in the John White paintings, not for any institution. She did it because she wanted to do it. And she did several in color, but I had her do even more in black and white, because I know university presses want everything in black and white. They're cheap. So I put in as many paintings of hers as are relevant here. And I'll be saying a word or two about them as I come. The other thing that interests me, and I think you will find it interesting too, and it may help to pull some more stuff together, is that I'm going to talk about Indian ways of life which would have affected the migration of Indian people, survivors or whatever, after the lost colonists were on the scene and the English came later and pushed them out. I'm also interested in the colonists' migration, and there are going to be distinct things in traditional North Carolina Algonquian speakers' culture. I always call Algonquian speakers, by the way. The Algonquians, I have been forcibly told over the decades, refers to that one tribe in Canada. So I always stick in speakers, even if it sounds pompous. But things would affect whether the local people could take so many colonists in. My question is, did they migrate to only one place, the colonists, or two places, or about 98 places? And I'll give you reasons for why I think what I do. And if you want to fight about it later, that's just fine. All right, first slide, please. The native people of this region inhabited a watery world, often with stretches of waters that were not only shallow but also very, very extensive. In that sense, it differs somewhat from Eastern Virginia. But some of the ecological things I'm going to put up are going to look like Virginia, but they apply here in subtly different ways. But there was a watery world and a great deal, compared to the region that I'm familiar with, of swampy woods, or just plain swamp, and or marsh. And those areas were moderately useful to Indians. They were not at all useful to the English. In fact, the English used to call such places the desert. And they didn't mean something dry. They meant something where you starve to death. So there were areas Indian people could use. And I've gone into elsewhere in publications to tell you what that would have been. I've done extensive plant lists and such. And I'll be coming back to it later with a definite thing in mind. Second slide, please. Most of the Indians' towns, and by town I mean a reasonably permanent village, not totally permanent, but the people would reside there for quite a part of the year in the very same spot. They might move the next year because their farms shifted. They practiced shifting cultivation. But in any one year, they would be about half the year in those towns. Inland, there would have been camps, but those would not have been inhabited more than a few nights before they moved on. Foraging requires different things from being a farming community. And by the way, if you're also a fishing community, you're going to be located in pretty much the same place, actually longer than the shifting cultivation would make you do, because you don't live with your knees up to your knees in water. You live on reasonably dry land, but you get your food, and in the matter of fish, certainly, the food comes to you. Awfully nice of it. Towns were used for, next please. Towns were used for farming. In eastern Virginia, I have not quite pinned it down for eastern North Carolina. I've just got indications. But the people lived on pieces of land with the optimum corn growing ability. And after you have practiced shifting cultivation for a few hundred years, you know where those areas are. And you choose to be there. Either that, or the gathering ought to be really, really good. And for that, you go to breadbasket marshes. If you want these explained, look at the traditional culture chapter in John Smith's Chesapeake Voyages. I did that one. Other people contributed a lot of hard science for that. That was a fun project, and I drove them nuts. They wanted a slave driver, and I gave them one. And we made our deadline. We had 15 months to produce it, total. All right? The women would know where the fields were. The women would also know where the breadbasket marshes are. They're the places that grow things like Tuckahoe and wild rice if you're in a freshwater area. Much less promising if the water is brackish or even salty. But up the rivers in my part of the world, and also very probably here, the women were going to choose where the downs were. The men moved around in going out and getting the food that they contributed. But the women had to know the land and exactly what it would grow and how to make it go. And that had some fallout. I'm going to diverge to Virginia for, I trust, only 10 seconds. When the Pamunkey Indian tribe decided in 1705 where to keep land for their reservation, and everything else got taken over by the enemy, they decided in favor of a place with good farmland. It still is good. It's naturally fertile because of alluvial washes from time to time, but also because there was a 400-plus acre stand of wild rice right across the river. And I've been told by the botanist who did the survey, it's still there. So the placement of today's Pamunkey Indian Reservation was a female decision. They had to get their men to tell the English, or it wouldn't have been listened to. Men have their uses. All right, next slide, please. You're familiar with this. These are some of the ladies who would do that farming. And I can guarantee that gourd would be pretty heavy about the time that she got it full of water. And I myself would wish for a handle on it, wouldn't you? That's all right. They were physically strong enough with the work that they did, that they could do stuff like that. And I talked to a biological anthropologist back when I was studying Tuckahoe intensively. And she said, it's very, very, very labor intensive. You got to pry the stuff up out from 2 feet down in the mud. She said she found clear evidence that the women were going arthritic in their backs by the time they reached their early 30s, if they lived that long. Next, please. This is Ren Harvey's black and white painting of the same lady, deliberately trying to make her look more Indian in the face, but also probably a more lifelike stance. She was not going to be a model for comparing costume or something like that. So Ren was trying to actually show her the way she would be shown to her own folks. Next, please. The men would go out hunting. They would go out fishing. And the part that I'm talking about right now is on land. So men's work in land areas actually was hunting not only of animals, it was hunting of people, raiding. The techniques they used overlapped heavily. The weapons they used overlapped, although nobody in his right mind went after a deer with a tomahawk, especially a Virginia Indian tomahawk. I'm not sure what they had here, but it was more like a scimitar, but it was made out of wood, and the long edge of it, the curving edge of it, was fire hardened. And yes, you could cleave a head with it, but a sword would be much better. Oh yes, definitely swords. Next, please. That is the same guy by Ren Harvey, and she did it in color, and it's on the cover of the book. That's the first one she did, and she was really thrilled to get into this, and she had a wonderful time corresponding with Kim Sloan, and she was really deep in this project before she ever contacted me. And then she asked me questions that fortunately I had a database I could go into, and I could find out in about 5 seconds flat exactly what beads were made out of and that sort of thing. So the database really, really helped. But she had a wonderful time doing these. Her career is taking off now with American Indian drawing, and especially archaeological drawings with artifacts. And the Indian people, Mississippian period is what interests her, the person actually holding it. And they look very, very Indian. All right, next please. The women went out for things like silk grass. This is Indian hemp. Oh gosh, going out of my head. Apicinum cannabinum, Indian hemp. I photographed that at the gate to my lane in Hampton. It grows there, and I get to play with it if I'm not completely sucked in with other things. I've got a lot to do with it. It will make very, very nice long fibers with distinctive, you can always tell that it's whether it's this plant or not, because the branches grow at 45-degree angles. It's distinctive in almost any field. And we've got fields that actually make a fair amount of it. But it takes a lot of preparation. It's really hard on your hands to work with. You've got to clean it and clean it and clean it and clean it. And then you come up with nice silky fibers that you can make stuff out of. So they would go out and they would get these. You want the stuff while it is fully grown. And I'm not so sure of the season after that, but you want it before it decomposes completely in the winter. Good stuff, good stuff. Other things women went out for. Women didn't stay home on farm. They didn't stay home. They were out and about. Sometimes their fields were well away anyway, so you got to get out. They also went out for nuts in the fall. This was generally done during a general hunt. The men would try to get a lot of deer. The women would process right on the spot, particularly to get the hides. But they were also going out nutting, because nuts made something called nut milk. And I'll try not to get going on this. My sister was a nutritionist, and I used to pick her brain. It was not only a high-status thing to feed to guests, because it tasted very rich, much richer than water. It could also be used in a pinch as baby formula. And if something happened to a mother, or she simply wasn't capable of making enough milk, or in the case I know of, 18th century Abenaki, when an English woman and her dying baby were brought back as captives. The women of the village, and this was Abenaki, not 5 nations, but the Abenaki women took one look at that kid, and they said, hold on, we'll get him something. And they did, and the kid pulled through. It's not a permanent baby formula because it doesn't have enough calcium. But otherwise, you can save lives with it. So you want lots of nuts. It's also a source of protein in the spring before you can get some of the other plants from which you can also get protein. All right, next please. This is Ren Harvey's take on my scenario, but the lady in the very closest you may have seen earlier today. Woman carrying a baby in John White. And I wanted to figure out, why on earth is she doing a semi-piggyback like that? That has always looked fearsomely uncomfortable to me. And when I told Ren what I wanted and we worked it out between us, the idea came to me. Bingo, I bet this is it. Invent a time machine for me, please, so I can go check it out. These are women who are carrying home a great deal of stuff. They've got a couple of girls off in the distance who are also helping with that. But nuts, again, in the aggregate, can be surprisingly heavy. And these women are having to carry that, in addition to a cradle board. But 2 of the 3 women have got toddlers, good-sized toddlers. If any of you have ever had contact with a toddler, you want to take a guess? They want to get up, Mommy, want to get up, Mommy. And one of them, the lady in front, is actually expecting the next one, so she better train that kid pretty fast that he's not going to get away with this much longer. So she picks him up in a half piggyback. And before long, I suspect most toddlers would say, Mommy, I want you to get down. And she puts him down and goes back to carrying nuts. That's my guess. Does that make sense to any of you? It does to the women, anyway. All right, next, please. Yeah, that's the lady. I put these in backwards, but yes, that's what it comes from. Next, please. I thought I had it done correctly. Gee. There we go. There we go. All portions of a drainage would be used by Indian people. I'm leading over towards the water because I'll say a pungent thing about that in a moment. But all of a drainage got used, and I realized this when I started trying to reconstruct Powhatan Indian ethnobotany. It took me 10 years, and I only got part of it published in 1997. In the higher elevations, and in Eastern Virginia, you really do get the feeling of terraces and that sort of thing. But it works over in this part of the world too. It's just that the gradient is more gradual. Farther inland, mostly forest, and you go to get forest things. Makes sense. Women were getting firewood. That, by the way, the only fuel they had was firewood. No coal, no kerosene, no expensive diesel. The women would go out for nuts. They also, both sexes could go out for various plants. A lot of the medicinal plants that have gotten recorded anyway occur in deciduous forest, if you could get hold of it. You can see the next terrace down in Eastern Virginia is usually about the 25-foot terrace. It doesn't get flooded too often, and you especially don't want that with salt water. But it's also fairly easy access to both forest and water. It's the middle territory. I talked twice this past week about the unpleasantness of 1622. I call it the Great Assault. And the major reason for that, I still think, and I use this to show it, the English were taking the farmlands, and they took them fast by 1621. And so the Indian people were furious about it. But they had additional fury because this was the middle area between the other areas the people were using. And even after they had lost the land and were trying to build villages in the wooded areas, they still had to go into the water as far as they can. Those were written in as treaty rights in 1677. They were still going into the waters, and they didn't want to get shot on the way. And so the better thing to do was to give the English a really vicious hint. Why don't you bastards go home? And of course, the English didn't take the hint. All right. You can see Tuckahoe plants. That's one kind of Tuckahoe. Tuckahoe, an Algonquian word, probably meant emergent plant. And there are several kinds of them, and I messed with all of them. Yellow swamp lily is one, and it's easier to get at than Tuckahoe. It also tastes like swamp, even when you try to prepare it and eat it, so it's not especially good as far as I'm concerned. But if you have got especially fresh water, there's special things you can grow. You can also get reeds to make mats to make the houses that the Indians lived in along the rivers. And it's no one kind of reed. You can make mats out of almost anything if you put your mind to it. And then down in the water, you've not only got migratory fowl, you've also got all these fish and shellfish. I didn't draw them in on this. So Indian people did use all of their territory. About the only thing they couldn't find something edible on would be oceanfront. Because you don't want to build a fish weir there. If you're almost out of your mind if you go fishing, they did not have the equipment to do fly fishing and get a really good way out there and get some fish of all sizes. Instead, next please. Instead, They either used fish weirs or they used canoes and did angling and spearfishing in places. It's shown in North Carolina. It's documented on the eastern shore of Virginia. But this is the kind of fish ware that actually was made here. And now I'm going to say an unpleasant word or two about John White and Theodore de Bry. And it will be dreadfully unfair. I admit it now. They showed a hedging, this long fence going out into the water. They don't make it real clear where it begins or where it ends, and they have got the trap on only one side. If you're going to catch fish in a weir, and I talked to Robert Lipson about this, the guy who wrote Life in Chesapeake Bay. He was on the John Smith's Chesapeake Voyages, so I grabbed him after one of our meetings and pounded him with questions. The fish you're going after not only swim around, but when they encounter something shallow or any obstruction, if they're going along a shore, they get an obstruction and they head out into deeper water hoping to go around it. Well, you don't know which direction the fish are going to be swimming in at any given moment, so you want your hedging to go right up to the shoreline, so they're definitely going to head out, and then you put bays. Not even the trap. The trap is that square thing at the end. You put bays, and the fish can swim in, so can shellfish, and they have no idea how to get out again. They'll just go round and round and round until they find the next exit. They're not real bright citizens, fish. And then they all are going to wind up in the trap, and that is when the trap is lined with a net, and you haul the net. A couple of guys in canoes can do this. And then you dip them out. And the dipping can be done by practically anybody over the age of 10. It wasn't automatically men's work. Building the weir was going to be men's work, and it is desperately hard work. But that's what a fish weir really looks like. And the ones up on Potomac River that were made by watermen in the 1930s actually had 3 sets of bays. In Fox Hill, near where I live, this was more of the norm. They had a couple of sets was all. It was specialized work. You had to know exactly how to angle the bays. And this is another reason why when the English said our weirs are broken and we can't fix them, they couldn't have fixed them to be as efficient as the Indian version. And quite frankly, the Indians built the ones that the colonists had. I looked carefully through the original documents for that, and it was definite. Indians built the weirs. Okay, next please. Canoes. Oh, good old canoes. Those are heavy SOBs, those canoes. And so I have got to, don't take issue, I think it was a flub on my friend Karen Kupperman when she said, you did XYZ about canoes, and when you come to a portage, you can lift it up over your head and move it. Friends, you ain't going to move one of them. How many of you have ever actually tried paddling a dugout canoe, a wooden dugout? I'm the third. Yeah. They are very, very heavy. Not only are they made out of logs and not birch bark. I think Karen was thinking about birch bark on the spur of the moment. They're made out of logs, and they're going to have to take a certain amount of punishment, especially if you run them aground, which is possible in the shifting sands, et cetera, et cetera. But you also are going to have something that, while it may be tippy, it's going to be hard to capsize. And so the log has got to be very, very thick on the bottom. I was a number 4 paddler in a log canoe made in 2007 by the Mariners Museum in Newport News. They heard I was fascinated with canoes, so they called me up and said, come on, try it. We'll give you a paddle. There were 4 of us. We were in about a 16-foot canoe. We did not know what we were doing because there was one thing that John White got right, and I hadn't picked up on it, little bright eyes here. If you want to paddle one of those things, you don't do it like a birch bark canoe on your knees with your back and your arms doing all the work. I ached for weeks afterward. That's what we were trying. You've got to do it. Next, please. Maybe I put it in. No, you got to stand up. He shows the paddler standing up. You've got to use every bit of your leg power as well because they are just so very, very heavy. Not only that, they are tippy. So you've got to have really good balance, but you do it better with your feet and your legs rather than your knees. But also, one other really nasty thing about dugouts, and we tried it in Virginia, in James River, Eric Holland and I from Jamestown Settlement several years before that. We found that any little breeze will start to push them to one side, and then they will lie there broadside, lollop, 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 lollop. So keeping them on course is not so much fun either. They're very, very difficult things to get around. And therefore, the point I'm making here is you don't have single lone paddlers of a dugout. You want at least 4 strapping human beings. I didn't happen to be one, so we didn't get much of anywhere. All right. Yes, next, please. Political gatherings were attended by water. In fact, visiting back and forth, all kinds of politicking, et cetera, was done by water. The canoe with multiple people in it, multiple women can do quite well also, but it's got to be multiples. But you can get all sorts of things, all sorts of reeds. Well, women would gather reeds, and reeds are something else I found out the hard way, are very, very heavy if they are thick enough reeds and you're doing a bundle about this big. And I found that out in the English village when they reached the houses at Jamestown Settlement. And they gave me a bundle to carry, and So go to the reed batch by canoe. Let the canoe drag the weight home. So women as well as men would be using canoes, including some female rulers. There would be some. We just don't know who they were in North Carolina. I know of several in Virginia. But people like this were important, but on ordinary days, they did everything ordinary people did. It was when the English showed up that this guy would be putting on his finest and being set apart, etc. I went through early documents again, looking for all of the accounts of meeting a chief. In all of them, the chief was decked out, and he was on his great dignity, which was what he was supposed to do. Ordinary days, he was a pretty ordinary Joe, as far as we know, because Indian towns and Indian families had much more autonomy than we realize. They did not have powerful leaders backed up by an army or even a police chief or even goons. So you're not going to find the same kind of power exerted. I will come back to that point later. I don't need to make it now. All right. Next, please. This is not connected with any John White painting. It's one that came out of my own noggin, and Ren Harvey drew it. Notice the different faces among the counselors there. They are counselors. One may even be a priest, although he is not decked out as such. But they have got an elderly man, a couple of good elderly men. They've also got a young man, probably an outstanding warrior. He's worth listening to if you are going to be dealing with potential enemies. And if he is looking suspicious and making direct eye contact, that means he's hostile. That's another thing I can get going on about an Indian society. I was in school with Indians out in Wisconsin when I was doing my doctorate. Had a big hulking Ojibwa office mate, as a matter of fact. You didn't make him mad about anything. Not if you value your life. And he was very big on politeness. And one of the things you don't do is stare at people. You don't make a lot of eye contact. And if it's really, really important, and my teacher took me to a visit with a guy, a doctor, traditional doctor in the Bedewiwin. And when he sat down to talk with us, he faced that way, she faced that way, and I already knew enough, face straight out. You don't make eye contact at all. But your antennae are jiggling the entire time. And just from knowing that bit of etiquette, he began talking to me, which was a thrill. So the stare on that young man means if somebody's going to say, let's go to war with the SOBs, that's going to be the guy that'll do it. Meanwhile, see all the stuff in the background? That's something the sources don't ever tell you about. But if you have ever had to be a host and hostess, ask the hostess, is there any preparation that has to be done before you have 18, 20 people come over? Mm-hmm. And if it's a chief being the host, then everybody else in the village, including the men, has got to help bring food in The corn may already be there, but somebody's got to go out hunting and fishing and trying to get deer and wild turkey, et cetera, et cetera. And you need to give plenty of prior notice before these people arrive. Well, the English didn't do that. In this case, they did, because it's still a pretty hair-raising thing that they're doing in the back, trying to get a tremendous feast going on, more than any 5 people could possibly eat. But it's understood that the common folks who have been standing off at a distance are going to be able to get the leftovers later, and there will be plenty of them. But that is the proper protocol for greeting a chief. Next, please. The first time that the English visited the town of Roanoke, they dropped in. I reread that several times. I couldn't believe my eyes. And Wingina, the chief's brother, was away, probably with a number of men. And there were mostly women there in the village. And the chief's wife, off at a distance, talking with the more important English people, she is trying to think furiously, all right, how do I feed these people? Come on, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? At the same time that she is perfectly calm. How nice of you to come. And meanwhile, there's always stuff going around of the edges of meetings, and this is just one of them. Do you recognize the woman? Acting rather demure and or embarrassed. That is a standard posture for many females, and very likely the Indians did have that. We don't have direct records. But if you're embarrassed and you wish the heck that you were somewhere else, or the other guy was somewhere else, that's the way she'd look. He, meanwhile, has not seen a living human female in about 3 months. And she is not wearing anything from the waist up. So he is having an eyeful, and she would like him to go to hell, please. Next, please. Yep, that's the lady, sorry. That's backwards, too. Next, please. Warfare. A bit on warfare. Warfare, traditionally, in eastern woodlands generally, was a matter of raids. They knew how to stage big assaults, and once in a while they would do it. But most of the time, it was going to be small scale. Yes, I know, I have 3 minutes. I may just jump the rest of it. No. It was mostly raids, and the major reason for it was if you have a relatively small population, and all of these folks did, small even by comparison with the English of the time, and minuscule by the comparison with us nowadays, you don't waste people. So with raids, that's how you use your own people, and if the defenders fight back too hard, you withdraw. And that's fine. You have another whack at them later, but you don't waste people. If you are taking prisoners, the prisoners that you take, maybe a few men that you can torture to death is fine, but what they really wanted was the non-combatants who were extremely useful, and that was women and children. Women could be breeders, children can be brainwashed and grown and made into your own people. You expanded your population, and that's a good thing. Keep that in mind, because it's going to affect where the colonists ended up when they were not rescued. Warfare took place also after getting advice of priests, so I'll do religion right quick. Next, please. That is a priest. Next, please. That is a conjurer. I cannot figure out for the life of me which guy does what. There are only the slightest indications in the records, and it's even worse for the Powhatans. But they had 2 different named positions anyway. Nothing got recorded. Probably nobody would tell them about whether they came from certain families, what their training was, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's why another reason I want a time machine, please, also an interpreter. Now, this gentleman is going to appear in something else. Next, please. John Lawson describes a Chaonic conjurer putting on a show. He took a 2-foot reed in his mouth, and he ran along the top of the water to cross what I figure was Bennett Creek, the tributary to the Tuan River. But he did it on top of the water. He didn't walk on water, by the way, he ran. So I had Ren do this. She was pretty sure there were spectators, because it was put on, the show was put on for people to keep them impressed. So there you have it. All right. As for what happened to the colony, I'll do my 2 minutes on that. When the colonists were not rescued, there were about 114 of them. Where do you send 114 people within a region of small towns, all with very limited population? We don't have population figures, but if we can go with analogy with the Powhatans, they would all have been small. Where do you go? Not only with small towns that cannot really support even 25 newcomers who hadn't the faintest idea how to get their own food. Where also do you do it when a drought has started? And the 3-year drought of the 1680s started in 1587. If you're not familiar with that drought, there is a fairly technical article in Nature that you can read about it, and I footnoted in my book. Where do you go? You go various places. You really have to disperse. Not only that, once the English were known to be in very bad case, the hostile tribes would have come out of the woodwork and begun capturing useful breeders and useful children too. And that would take more colonists in different directions. And this is why I say in my book that probably they wound up within a very few years scattered all over eastern North Carolina, maybe into the Piedmont. Well, not to the mountains. But you're talking about a dispersal. Next, please. Yeah, that's the border territory that they can cover. Next, please. I want to get to it. English came. Next, please. There we are. In the case of just one tribe. The ones who were able, when the English began pouring in, to stay within their own territories, oftentimes found themselves on increasingly small pieces of land, and very often they had to retreat to swampy areas that they know how to make a living in, but the English weren't interested in. And the Wampanoag show up very well how this would have gone. Next, please. As for the people along the Outer Banks, some did stay there because the English didn't really want the banks either, not for making villages and trying to set up towns and the rest. It was going to be a military outpost. And some of the people very likely did stay. I'm inclined to believe they did. Others of them within Croatoan society, I think, would have gone over to Mattamuskeet. There are people called Hatteras at Mattamuskeet. You can see it in the map there. They went both places. Why? Why didn't they go in a bunch? Indian people had autonomy. Families were autonomous. It was a family decision, not a tribal decision. And some families decided to stay put, and some of them went. It was their privilege in Indian society. It was not an authoritarian society such as England was trying so hard to be. And that affected the dispersal as well. Now I'm done.